I secured them an audition at Decca on New Year's Day 1962. They came to London and stayed at the Royal Hotel, paying 27 shillings a night for bed and breakfast. They were poor and I wasn't rich, but we all celebrated with rum and scotch and coke, which was becoming a Beatle drink even then.
Welcome back to Beatles Storytime. In this video, I'm going to look at Brian Epstein's role in transforming the Beatles from a rowdy act with a local following to one that was loved across the UK. I will also be looking at the events behind the fabled Decca Demo and the Beatles signing to EMI. Let's start with Brian's background. Brian Samuel Epstein was born on the 19th of September 1934 in a private nursing home in Liverpool. His parents ran a successful furniture store. Brian shifted from one private boarding school in England to another, as he was expelled for laziness and poor performance. He suffered greatly because of his repressed homosexuality, which was illegal in England for the entire length of his life. A sensitive and passionate soul, Brian fell in love with the arts and initially wanted to become a fashion designer. He wrote home to his parents expressing this desire when he was 16, but his father, Harry, was adamantly opposed. Brian was instead sent to work as an apprentice at a book and record store in London for 6 months, and then reported for duty at his family's furniture store in Liverpool on a £5 a week wage. In December 1952, Brian was conscripted into national service. He worked as a data entry clerk for the British Royal Army and was posted near Regent's Park in London. Brian used this posting to explore London's high cultural scene. By January 1954, Brian had been seen by numerous army psychiatrists who recommended, almost certainly with regards to his homosexuality, that Brian be given medical discharge. Returning to Liverpool, his father put him back to work at the furniture store, where it was obvious how bored Brian was. Harry was somewhat desperate for Brian to settle into a respectable position like Brian's younger brother Clive. After expanding the family business into the neighbouring North End music store, locally known as Nems, Harry gave the role of running the music store to Brian in 1955. In September 1956, Brian took a trip to London to meet a friend, but was robbed of his passport, birth certificate, chequebook, wristwatch, and all the money he had in his possession. He didn't want his parents to find out, so he worked as a department store clerk until he earned enough money to buy a train ticket home. Once he returned home, he confessed his homosexuality to a psychiatrist who was a friend of the Epstein family. During the session with the psychiatrist, Brian explained how much he loved the theatre and thought about becoming an actor. As a consequence, Brian was allowed by his parents to go back to London to study at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, also known as RADA. In autumn 1956, Brian commenced a 2-year course at RADA. His classmates included Albert Finney and Peter O'Toole. Brian dropped out in his 3rd term, however, as he felt that he had become too much of a businessman by this point to be a student again, and he really disliked being a student anyway. In April 1957, whilst he was still at RADA, Brian was arrested for soliciting an undercover policeman for sex near Swiss Cottage tube station in northwest London. He appeared at a courthouse in Marylebone the next day and pleaded not guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years probation. In May 1959, whilst serving that probation, he was assaulted by a casual sex partner in Liverpool, who then extorted him for hush money. Initially, Brian was reticent about the event, but forced himself to inform the police. This, in turn, meant testifying in court and revealing his sexual orientation to his family. The court barred the press from revealing his identity during the trial. His assailant was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and Brian was not charged. Brian walked free in no small part because of his family background and class status. Had he not been middle class, privately educated, and from a well-respected Jewish family that was seen as a pillar of the community, I doubt the judge would have been quite so understanding. With all of this chaos hopefully behind him, Brian returned to the NEMS store in Great Charlotte Street, Liverpool. This store now had a record department that Brian was greatly interested in improving. He worked day and night to make it one of the biggest record stores in the north of England. NEMS opened a second store in Whitechapel, Liverpool, which Brian also ran. Across the road from this store was the Lewis department store, where Peter Brown was employed. Watching Peter's sales technique, Brian was sufficiently impressed by Peter to lure him to work for him at NEMS. After the Beatles' success, Peter Brown subsequently became a top-level Beatles insider and employee at Apple. The success of the NEMS record store was a relief to Harry and Queenie, Brian's long-suffering parents. Ultimately, they just wanted him to settle into an honourable profession that made Brian happy and tamed his wild, impulsive urges to start novel projects, only to just as suddenly abandon them for a new thrill. However, by 1961, NEMS was a well-oiled machine, thanks to all the organising and staff training that Brian had instilled into the business. Consequently, he became bored again, and that usually spelt trouble. In September 1961, Brian took an unusually long 5-week holiday in Spain, partly due to this boredom. When he returned from holiday, little did he know that his new career as a pop impresario was about to begin. My Bonnie, a rock and roll single performed by Tony Sheridan and the Beatles, was released in Germany on Monday the 23rd of October 1961. Former Beatles bassist Stuart Sutcliffe stayed behind in Hamburg and sent over the initial copies to the Beatles in Liverpool. Overjoyed to finally have their playing on a proper chart-selling record, the Beatles played it on repeat. Then teenager Jimmy Campbell, later to be a rock musician himself, said that Paul McCartney ran up the stairs of the Aintree Institute, shouting, "This is our record!" He asked the resident DJ, Bob Wooler, to play it to the crowd. Bob was a fatherly figure and a guide for the Beatles at this time, and he did his best to promote them in the clubs that he worked at as a DJ and compere. I suspect this was probably connected to the fact that he also was in the employment of Alan Williams, the Beatles' former manager. Bob was a secretive man, though. He would often get dropped off home by the Beatles when they drove home in their van, but Bob would never let them come in his house and often made excuses to deny them access. Bob knew that something had to happen for the Beatles at this point, if they were ever to truly become successful musicians. He offered to write to Jack Good, who was now at Decca. He was formerly the producer of the TV music show Oh Boy, the same show that Tony Sheridan appeared on many times. That offer never had to be realised, because, just in time and in true fairy tale fashion, Brian Epstein was about to enter the Beatles' story and make all of their dreams come true. I also find it curious that Bob knew the contact details for Jack Good in the first place. Now let's talk about the legend of how Brian came to know the Beatles. According to the urban legend, the consequence of Bob Wooler's promotion of the My Bonnie record was that Raymond Jones, a young man from Knotty Ash, was said to have walked into the NEMS Whitechapel store to try to buy the record. Obviously, he could not buy it straight away, because it had only been released in Germany at that point. However, NEMS had a reputation of never turning down a customer's request for a record, no matter how obscure it was. A note about the request was left for the NEMS manager Brian Epstein by his personal assistant Alistair Taylor. Returning from his 5-week Spanish holiday, Brian was intrigued by the inquiry and enjoyed the challenge of locating the unusual record. By his own admission, Brian was somewhat bored with managing the store at this point, and this new mystery gave him something unusual to do. Brian also claimed that 2 other girls came into NEMS to order the single, and so, now with 3 orders for the My Bonnie record within a few days, he wanted to know more about the band. There are other versions of this story, however. Firstly, Brian's personal assistant Alistair Taylor later said in the 1990s that he had made up the order by using the details of a regular customer from their database and paid the deposit money himself. This story was then countered by the supposedly real Raymond Jones, who then made himself and his version of events known to the broadcaster and writer Spencer Lee. Meanwhile, Bill Harry, the founder of the Mersey Beat music paper, also had his own backstory. In June 1961, Bill had launched Mersey Beat, which was immediately extremely popular due to the fact that he had no competition, and there was a plethora of local bands to see perform, but little way to know when or where any of them were playing. He had sold 5,000 copies of the first issue at local newsagents. Bill then thought it would be a good idea to sell some copies of his paper at the NEMS record store, and so he set up a meeting about it with Brian Epstein. Via his discussion with Bill Harry about Mersey Beat, Brian was stunned to find out that the local area had such a wealth of talent. Bill had just completed his National Diploma in Design at the Liverpool School of Art. It was at the art school that Bill had become close friends with John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. Naturally then, he had heavily promoted the Beatles in his paper. In fact, the Beatles were on the front cover of the second issue, which was sold at NEMS. That July 1961 issue had the headline, "Beatles Sign Recording Contract," which referenced the My Bonnie recording sessions that the Beatles made in Hamburg with Tony Sheridan. As of the third issue in August 1961, Brian Epstein placed ads in the Mersey Beat and also wrote a regular music column called "Stop the World and Listen to Everything in It," Brian Epstein of NEMS. Bill Harry said he felt it was impossible for Brian to not have some idea of who the Beatles were, especially as Bill had been trying his best to plug the Beatles to Epstein for months. Also, it must be pointed out that the German release of My Bonnie did not have the name The Beatles listed on it. Even if Brian had found the record order number in a list of German records, it still would not have been attributed to the Beatles. It would have been listed as a record by Tony Sheridan with the Beat Brothers. Bill Harry's version of events seems more plausible to me. The Raymond Jones story that Brian Epstein wrote about in his 1964 autobiography, A Cellar Full of Noise, seems like an invented cover story. Whether Brian dreamt it up or he was told to tell this tale does not really matter. Once the official narrative had been decided upon, many others simply repeated it without question, and it became ever more accepted. It would not have been difficult for the controllers of the Beatles psyop to have hired an actor to play the Raymond Jones character in the 1990s either. However it actually happened, once Brian's interest in the Beatles was piqued, he wanted to find out who the Beatles were, and whether or not it was worth his while ordering 50 copies of their single for NEMS. At the same time, the Beatles were in a difficult position. After the Hamburg recording sessions with Tony Sheridan in June 1961, the Beatles returned to Liverpool with a dwindling number of promoters who would let them play at their venues. Their regular and largely female crowd loved them, but local promoters did not. This was because of their general unreliability and sometimes rowdy behaviour under the influence of drink and/or drugs. They had regular work in the Liverpool area, but rarely ventured beyond it. They often played the Casbah and the Aintree Institute at weekends, and the Cavern Club once or twice a day during the week. Without their regular Cavern Club gigs, they would have struggled financially. Most local bands had members that were engaged in other employment during the week. They played with their bands only at the weekend. The Beatles were fairly unique in that they had no other jobs, which meant that they were available to play at lunchtimes in the Cavern. This was the main reason why they became the main house band at the Cavern. Around this time, the Beatles had a small fan club run by two of their regular attendees from the Cavern. They were Jennifer Dawes and Maureen O'Shea. Paul's dad, Jim McCartney, got to know the Beatles' early female fans, and especially Jennifer and Maureen. He even invited them over to his house for tea and suggested to them that they should become the Beatles' managers, which they briefly attempted to do, but only until Brian entered the picture. Jim told the girls that he had never seen the Beatles play at the Cavern, so the girls took him there, and he quickly became a regular attendee himself of their lunchtime gigs, because the Cavern was only a short walk away from his office. He would even drop off his food shopping with Paul and ask him to take it home with him after the Beatles had finished playing. Am I alone in finding this a little odd? When I think about my friends' bands, back when I was in my late teens and early 20s, in all of the local venues that I watched them play at, I can't ever remember seeing their parents in the crowd. I think it would have been regarded as very uncool and not at all rock and roll for any of them to have had their dad there, as Paul did. For me, this is just another reason to be suspicious of Jim McCartney. Let's get back to Brian. On Thursday, the 9th of November 1961, Brian talked to Bill Harry, the founder of the Mersey Beat music paper, and asked him about the Beatles. Bill informed Brian that the Beatles would be playing that day at the lunchtime session at the Cavern, which was just 200 steps away from Nems at 10 Matthew Street. Brian asked Bill to phone the Cavern and let them know that he would be attending. Bill naturally obliged Brian and contacted the new Cavern owner, Ray McFall, who, in turn, arranged with the doorman, Paddy Delaney, to allow both Brian and his assistant Alistair Taylor to attend the club without a membership card. Brian had attended the Cavern back in its days as a jazz club, because then it was run by his Jewish friend, Alan Sitner. As boys, Brian and Alan attended the same synagogue. However, Brian had not visited the Cavern since those jazz club days, and he was nervous about going there now. It was a beat group venue by that point, and he would be surrounded by many teenagers. In short, he would feel like a fish out of water. In any case, on that smoggy, cold Thursday in November, Brian and his assistant made their way to the Cavern and found themselves in a cellar full of noise. Bob Wooler was in the band room when Brian was ushered in by the doorman. Bob recognised him from Nems, although they had never met. In a break between songs, Brian asked Bob if that was the Beatles on stage. Bob Wooler confirmed that it was, and then Brian made his way to the central tunnel and watched. At this point, Brian now recognised the Beatles as being the same leather-clad, loitering group of young men that often frequented his shop. This is how Brian described that day in the Cavern. Quote, "It was pretty much an eye-opener to go into this dark and dank, smoky cellar in the middle of the day, and to see crowds of kids watching these four young men on stage. They were rather scruffily dressed, in the nicest possible way, or should I say in the most attractive way. Black leather jackets and jeans, long hair of course, and rather untidy stage presentation, not terribly aware and not caring very much what they looked like. I think they cared more, even then, what they sounded like. Their presentation left a little to be desired, as far as I was concerned, because I'd been interested in the theatre and acting a long time, but amongst all of that, something tremendous came over, and I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humour on stage. They were very funny. Their ad-libbing was excellent. I liked them enormously. I immediately liked the sound that I heard, and I heard their sound before I met them. I think that's actually important, because it should always be remembered that people hear their sound before they meet them. I thought their sound was something an awful lot of people would like. They were fresh and they were honest, and I thought they had a sort of presence and, this is a terribly vague term, a star quality, whatever that is. They had it. At least, I sensed they had it." End quote. At the Cavern that day, Brian eventually spoke to the Beatles, who were very surprised to see him. Brian asked them about the backstory to the My Bonnie single and where it could be sourced. He also had the single played to him by Bob Wooler whilst they were both still at the Cavern. Brian wanted to know if it was worth importing more copies. After the initial few requests for the single, Brian had ordered 25 copies. Brian stuck up a notice in the NEMS window reading, "Beatles record available here." All 25 copies from that initial order were sold within hours of being received. So Brian ordered another 50 copies and began to wonder if the Beatles had more potential than he had first realised. Brian attended the Cavern again, trying to look inconspicuous, but failing miserably. Brian was well scrubbed, shaved, aftershaved, deodorized, and manicured to the point of wearing clear nail varnish to give his fingernails a clean shine. He didn't walk with a mince, but his physicality had a daintiness that begged the question. Outside of the Cavern, few people were as well groomed and smartly dressed as Brian, so in a dank, subterranean club full of teenagers, Brian stood out like the proverbial sore thumb. He made an agreement with the Beatles to meet them again on the 29th of November at his Whitechapel store after closing time. Later, Brian took Peter Brown to the Cavern. Beyond helping Brian to run the Whitechapel NEMS store, he was also one of Brian's closest friends. Of the Cavern, he said that he, quote, "thought it was hideous, full of nasty girls from Tate and Lyle. It was dark, small, sweaty, and you couldn't get a drink." End quote. Like Brian, he recognised the Beatles as the lads who used to hang around his NEMS store. With regards to the idea that Brian only managed the Beatles because he had sexual desires towards John, Peter also said this, quote, "For me personally at that time, Paul was the most attractive with his baby face, but Brian wasn't drawn to his type at all. His type was a working-class boy who was a bit rough, unrefined, and with a lot of attitude. John pretended he was rough trade, the teddy boy type, and this was certainly of more interest to Brian. But whilst I'm sure that liking the look of John was an element of Brian's interest, I don't believe for a moment that it was the motivation for him to want to manage them. Brian was far too honest to do that. That would be a Machiavellian thing to do, and Brian wasn't like that." Bob Wooler also commented on John's stage behaviour. Quote, "John Lennon commanded the stage with the way that he stared and stood. His legs would be wide apart. That was one of his trademarks, and it was regarded as being very sexual and very aggressive. The girls up front would be looking up his legs, keeping a watch on the crotch." End quote. I've no doubt that the vision of beautiful, leather-clad rockers on stage was something quite exciting for Brian, but the idea that Brian only wanted to manage the Beatles due to some internal homoerotic fantasy neglects other equally important facets of Brian's character. I rather get the impression that Brian had spent most of his life in something of a gilded cage. He was obviously middle class, and he'd had an excellent private education, but he'd also had all of his desires and dreams constantly squashed, and his sexuality was quite literally illegal. I suspect that in some regards he felt a little trapped, especially because he had an impulsive streak that usually got the better of him. Before he met the Beatles, he'd had a long line of passion projects that were energetically devoured one moment and just as easily discarded the next. And these, of course, were just the activities that didn't result in him either being expelled or appearing in court. I think Brian pounced upon the idea of managing the Beatles because of the way that they made him feel, which was liberated. I think Brian probably felt alone and straitjacketed for much of his life because of the kind of background that he came from, one that he continually failed to conform to. But through the Beatles, he could live vicariously, the kind of life he'd always wanted. I think he loved the Beatles because they were unapologetically themselves, which most people never are. Most people conform to whatever is expected of them, and they fall in line. Brian didn't want to fall in line, and he sensed that the Beatles didn't want to either. So the friendships Brian had with the Beatles must have seemed very precious to him. In 1964, whilst promoting his autobiography, Brian was asked in an interview why he had wanted to manage the Beatles, and he said, quote, "I liked them very much indeed. I liked them even more off stage than on. Everything about the Beatles was right for me. The kind of attitude to life, the attitude that comes out of their music, and their humour, and their personal way of behaving. It was all just what I wanted. They represented the direct, unself-conscious, good-natured, uninhibited human relationships which I hadn't found and had always wanted and felt deprived of. And my own sense of inferiority evaporated with the Beatles because I knew I could help them and that they wanted me to help them and trusted me to help them." End quote. On Wednesday, the 29th of November 1961, the Beatles met Brian at the NEMS Whitechapel store. They were due to go to his store early in the afternoon, after the Beatles' lunchtime cavern session finished. However, they got sidetracked into a drinking session at the Grapes, and so they arrived late at NEMS, with Bob Wooler in tow. They brought Bob along because they didn't know if Brian was going to be a con man, and they wanted Bob's opinion. John, ever the joker, introduced Bob to Brian as his dad, which surprised everyone, especially Bob. Brian can't have been impressed at both their tardiness or their lubricated state, but, undetermined, he still wanted to know the full backstory of the My Bonnie single and their history as a group. He also explained why he wanted to know, and that he'd already taken the liberty of talking to some London-based record companies. He had started the process of setting up auditions for them, if they were interested, which of course they were. Brian had appointments with Decca and EMI set up for Friday the 1st of December. The Beatles then agreed a mutual getting-to-know-you probationary period with Brian, who said that he would try his best, but confessed his lack of experience in managing a band. The Beatles appreciated his honesty and realised that Brian did at least know how to make and keep money. NEMS was a very successful business, and his management of NEMS demonstrated that Brian certainly knew how to sell records. He had a lot of contacts with record companies as a result. For example, at that time, Brian sold £20,000 worth of Decca records per annum through NEMS. That's close to £500,000 worth of records today. He was a valued retailer for Decca, and Brian had negotiated a sizable discount with Decca for NEMS as a result. It was a similar story for EMI. The Beatles fixed another meeting with Brian at NEMS on Sunday the 3rd of December at 4:30 p.m, when Brian would report back to the Beatles the outcome of his London meetings. The shop would be closed, of course, but Brian said that he would be stock-keeping for Christmas, trying to keep up his promise to his parents that the NEMS business would not suffer if he managed the Beatles. Sometime around the 30th of November 1961, Brian went to visit Alan Williams, the Beatles' former manager. The Beatles fell out with Alan because they had booked themselves to play the Top 10 club in Hamburg without Alan's knowledge and, more crucially, without paying him his cut of their earnings as their manager. Naturally then, Brian sought Alan's advice about managing the Beatles. In an interview many years later, Alan Williams recalled this meeting with Brian Epstein. Quote, "When he told me he wanted to manage the Beatles, I said, 'Brian, don't touch them with a fucking barge pole.' He didn't use language like that, but he took it in his stride, as a gentleman would. He had the class I didn't have, and, with having the music shop, he also had the credibility of some sort of lever. I could tell he wasn't going to manage the Beatles for money, and that he wasn't a typical showbiz manager who'd rip them off. He loved them. I could see that. Brian Epstein was the best thing that happened to the Beatles, because he was devoted. In the end, as he was leaving, I called out, 'Just make sure you sign them up, because they'll let you down.'" On Friday the 1st of December 1961, Brian attended his meetings with Decca and EMI. He'd taken the overnight sleeper train to London. He'd also taken with him the original contract that Bert Kaempfert had made with the Beatles on behalf of Polydor, and several copies of My Bonnie. It's also possible he had photos of the Beatles that had been taken by Jürgen Vollmer at the Top 10 Club. Naturally, his contacts at the record companies were with sales directors. Firstly, he met with Ron White at EMI. Also, it's curious to know that even then he'd already met the EMI managing director Len Wood, usually known as LG. In fact, LG was quoted as saying, "I knew Epstein very well before he had a contract with the Beatles. He used to come down to town, join us at special industry dinners and sit at our table. A good man." End quote. He did not meet with LG that day, only Ron White, who promised to play My Bonnie to the 4 A&R men at EMI, namely Wally Ridley, Norman Newell, Norrie Paramore and George Martin. Although we are now told that this did not happen, only Wally Ridley and Norman Newell heard the record before rejecting it. Ron White also offered to translate the German Polydor contract for free and return it back to Brian. Brian also went to Decca that day. He met with the sales manager, Sidney Beecher Stevens, and his assistant, Colin Borland. They were aware that Brian, as the manager of NEMS, was an important reseller for Decca. In addition to the £2,000 worth of records he sold for them at NEMS, he also placed adverts for their records in the Liverpool Echo, which also pushed their products. It would have been bad-mannered and frankly poor business practice to have not at least given Brian a standard audition agreement for the Beatles, so they did. It was Brian's influence as a businessman and as an important client of Decca that earned the Beatles their audition at Decca. It had little to do with the Beatles and the My Bonnie record. On the same day, Brian met up with Tony Barrow, who used to write a music column for the Liverpool Echo under the pseudonym of Disca. Tony had since moved to London, where he had begun writing liner notes for Decca releases. Tony Barrow later told a story about that day that does not make any sense. Tony claimed that Brian met him at Decca and played an acetate to him of audio taken from a TV broadcast of the Beatles, which had been made at the Cavern. However, the Beatles had never been filmed at the Cavern at that point. If Brian had possessed audio of the Beatles beyond their recording with Tony Sheridan, surely Brian would have played it to the record label contacts that he met that day, rather than playing My Bonnie. Tony Barrow said that he logged Brian's inquiry about the Beatles with the marketing department, but who knows if that's true either. Tony claims that he had a hand in setting up the Beatles' audition with Decca, but this is also incredibly unlikely. Brian's clout as a large retailer of Decca records would have already made that a done deal. Tony later became the Beatles' press officer and publicist, so I guess he became used to making up stories. At 4:30 p.m. on Sunday the 3rd of December 1961, Brian and the Beatles met up again to discuss what had taken place during those Friday meetings in London. They met at the Whitechapel store, and everyone was on time, except for Paul, who was very late. Brian did not want to speak until everyone was present, so that he did not have to repeat himself. Eventually, after 45 minutes of waiting for Paul, Brian asked George Harrison to phone Paul's house. He came back to report that Paul had only just got up, was now having a bath, and he'd be along when he was ready. Brian, who was a stickler for punctuality, thought this was disgraceful behaviour. "How can he be so late for an important thing?" he snapped. "Well," replied George, "he'll be late, but at least he'll be very clean." With Paul present, they finally got to talk at about 6 p.m. During this meeting, Brian discussed taking over the management of bookings, a job that Pete Best had been doing. Brian also said he would talk to the Beatles' accountant, Keith Smith. Brian made it clear that he wanted to get them a contract with a record label and to get them photographed, preferably wearing better attire. Later on, John Lennon said that Paul didn't want Brian as a manager, and that Paul would turn up late for meetings and even gigs in order to sabotage them. This seems like a strange thing for Paul to have done. One explanation might be that Paul was extra cautious as a reaction to John's impulsive behaviour. Even at that meeting on the 3rd of December 1961, John had already uttered the fabled words, "Right then, Brian, manage us, now where do I sign?" before Brian's percentage as their manager had even been negotiated. When it was discussed, we are told that it was Paul who led that conversation. The next day, one of Brian Epstein's first decisions as their manager was to appoint Roberta "Bobby" Brown, who was friends with Paul's girlfriend Dot, as their new fan club secretary. Straight away, Brian got Bobby to apply to the music publisher Alfred Schecht to get a British release of My Bonnie. Alfred was the one who had published Tony Sheridan's arrangements of his single. They told Alfred that there was a, quote, "very high demand from Merseyside teenagers for the single," which really wasn't true. It was popular among the small following of the Beatles, but not the whole of Merseyside. On Tuesday the 5th of December 1961, Graham Pauncefort, an assistant sales manager at Deutsche Grammophon, Great Britain, made one of his occasional visits to Liverpool's record dealers. Brian was his biggest seller through NEMS, but also his friend. Brian wanted to talk to Graham about the Beatles. They had both been in Hamburg earlier that year at an industry function, and although they hadn't seen or met the Beatles, they had come close. Brian introduced Graham to the Beatles. He said that they were in leather and jeans and were surprisingly reverential. Describing that day, Graham said, quote, "I was very ambitious for Polydor, sub-label of Deutsche Grammophon, to expand into pop, and keen to hear what Brian had to say." End quote. Over lunch, Brian told Graham about the situation with the Bert Kaempfert contract. Graham said, quote, "When I got back to London, I would do what I could to help. I dictated a memo to my boss and told him My Bonnie should be issued in Britain, that we should take it forward." End quote. The combination of Graham's requests and Brian's large import order of My Bonnie vinyls persuaded Deutsche Grammophon to release My Bonnie in the UK on the 5th of January 1962. That meant that a Beatles, not a Beat Brothers, record would be available all over the UK, and not just NEMS. Brian was trying to get the Beatles away from their contract with Bert Kaempfert as soon as possible. It would also help if My Bonnie was a UK hit. Given Polydor had little promotional muscle in the UK, This was unlikely, but Brian wanted to try. Brian's next agenda was to dress the Beatles better. He also made them promise to behave more politely on stage. This included not eating or drinking during their performances, and also to bow at the end. This list of requests all came from Brian's background in London theatre and his time at RADA. Next, Brian visited all the parents of the Beatles, partly because 3 of them were underage and couldn't sign their own contracts. Most importantly, he visited Mona Best and won her support. She had been promoting what she considered to be her son's band. But now she was pregnant and she couldn't promote the band anymore. The father of her then unborn child was Neil Aspinall, her son Pete's best friend. This is a very curious arrangement. I think if my best friend had had an affair with my parent and a pregnancy was the result, I'm not sure how happy I would be about that. Doubly so if that had taken place during my late teens. Even at the time, Neil was the Beatles' roadie. Much later, he would become the chief exec at Apple. I also found it odd that Neil did not abandon his position, or even just commiserate with Pete, when the Beatles fired Pete as their drummer. With friends like these, who needs enemies? On Wednesday the 6th of December 1961, Brian went to see Keith Smith, the Beatles' accountant, to draw up his contract with the Beatles. He had originally gone to his solicitor friend, Rex Makin, for the task, but Rex thought managing the Beatles was another of Brian's follies, and this upset Brian. It took a while for the final contract to be fully drawn up. In fact, there were 3 drafts of it. It was actually finalised by David Harris, Silverman, Livermore and Co., and signed in January 1962. In the end, the contract wasn't legally binding because, initially, Brian didn't sign it, and Paul, George and Pete were underage and couldn't sign it without their signatures countersigned by a parent. There is much speculation as to why Brian didn't sign the contract until October 1962. Some say that he wanted to give the Beatles an escape plan if he failed to help them out, but surely that escape plan would also have benefited him. Also, on Wednesday the 6th of December 1961, the Beatles started to play their own songs at the Cavern. They did not play them anywhere else, because the Cavern audiences were like family, and the Beatles trusted the response of the crowd to be positive. The 3 songs they started to play were Love of the Loved, Hello Little Girl, and Like Dreamers Do. All of these songs would also be featured in their performance at Decca. I'm prepared to believe that John and Paul wrote these songs because they are derivative of the kind of songs they played every day. Plus, those 3 songs were written between 1957 and 1959, meaning that they received between 3 and 5 years of reworking before they were played live. Of course, there is still the possibility that they were written for them, but I don't personally believe that the Beatles had songs written for them until they were signed to EMI. Lastly, on page 107 of Memoirs, Billy claims that these 3 songs were written by John and Paul. On Friday, the 8th of December 1961, Brian sent a letter to Ron White at EMI, on the pretext of being disappointed to have not had word from him since their meeting 7 days earlier. He wanted to G EMI along, telling them that a Deutsche Grammophon man had seen the Beatles, and next week a Decca A&R spokesperson will be coming to Liverpool to see them too. Brian said in his letter, quote, "As you may appreciate, if we could choose, it would certainly be EMI." End quote. His letter crossed in the post with one from Ron White, returning the original Camphert contract with a typed English translation, free and at the courtesy of EMI. Around the same time, Paul received a letter from Alan Williams' solicitor Charles Monroe to say that Alan's case against the Beatles had lapsed and was over. The Beatles' typical set in December 1961 included their 3 allegedly original songs, plus 2 new editions of September in the Rain and Please Mr. Postman. Billy Hatton of the 4Js spoke about how much it impressed him that it only took the Beatles a week to learn a new song, when it took his band a month to do the same. In particular, he remembered hearing them play Please Mr. Postman a week after its final release in the UK, and he was really struck by how tightly they could already play it. As a classically trained pianist, I was amused by this story. I could read a 3-minute pop song straight off the page if it was notated. Alternatively, I could work it out by ear and have it memorized within an hour. Needing a week, never mind a month, seems excessive to me, even if we factor in band rehearsal. But then, I suppose that's the point. I think the controllers of the Beatles PSYOP hired musicians to play on their records, not because the Beatles couldn't play those songs at all, but rather because it took them far too long to learn to play the 14 songs that constituted the average length of their early albums. If the Beatles had learned to play their new songs consecutively rather than concurrently, it would have taken them 3.5 months to learn to play a whole album, and more time on top of that to record it. Once the Beatles were contracted to EMI, they had to release an album every 6 months, plus singles, B-sides, and special releases for their fan club members. Add in all the touring, press meetings, and other public appearances, and there simply would not be enough working hours in a day, week, or month to get everything done. Even if the Beatles had learned 3 to 4 songs per week, it would still have taken them a whole month to learn to play a new set of songs for an album. On Wednesday, the 13th of December 1961, Decca A&R man Mike Smith was in Liverpool at the Cavern. The Beatles, and especially Paul, were all worried that Mike Smith would prefer Gerry and the Pacemakers to the Beatles, so Brian took Mike to dinner so that he missed most of Gerry and the Pacemakers' set, but saw all of the Beatles' set. Impressed, Mike said, quote, "It was incredibly hot, crowded, smoky, but very exciting at the Cavern. Everyone's reaction to the Beatles was amazing. It was very early in my career as a producer. They were probably one of the first people I'd seen play live. I didn't have the power to give them a contract that night in the Cavern, but I told Brian they should come down to London for a test in the studio." End quote. The date set for this was, notably, the 1st of January 1962. Some people are very surprised that the Beatles recorded on New Year's Day, but this was not a public holiday in England until 1975. By Tuesday, the 19th of December 1961, Brian received a no from EMI. Ron White said he had played My Bonnie to EMI's artiste managers, who concluded the company had, quote, "sufficient groups of this type at the present under contract," end quote. Of course, EMI had to turn them down. They weren't ready for the Beatles PSYOP yet. The Beatles were destined to be signed to EMI, but perhaps with the hope that they would be able to play on their own records. Ron White, according to the managing director L.G. Wood, had only played the My Bonnie record to 2 of the 4 A&R men at EMI, Wally Ridley and Norman Newell. Officially, they turned it down because they said, quote, "it sounded like a bad recording of The Shadows," end quote. Except that My Bonnie doesn't sound anything like The Shadows, so this seems like an official cover story to me. In any case, the record hadn't been played to Norrie Paramor or George Martin at that point. On the 16th of December 1961, the music magazine Disc had a headline reading, "More beat groups than ever, but they don't stand a chance on Disc." End quote. Journalist Dick Tatum interviewed 2 record managers for his article, including George Martin, who said, quote, "A beat group represents more problems than does a solo artist," end quote. This really makes me wonder what the longer-term agenda was for the social controllers. What was the point of converting from a pop music model of solo artists with backing bands or someone and the somethings, like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, to that of a model with bands of roughly equal members? Maybe the idea played better into the ideology of the communes that were to flourish after the 1967 Summer of Love. On Sunday the 17th of December 1961, the Beatles had PR photos taken by Albert Marion at Wallasey Village, albeit still in their leathers. Brian did, of course, pay for all the Beatles to have new shoes and tailor-made suits, but these were not ready until their performance at the Manchester Playhouse Theatre on the 7th of March 1962. This was their first performance for BBC Radio, and it was in front of a live audience. Friday, the 22nd of December 1961, was the deadline for submissions for the Merseybeat poll to find the best band in the area. This seems to have meant very little in the end, since all the bands involved, including the Beatles, seem to have cheated with fake ballots. By Wednesday, the 27th of December 1961, the Beatles had a Christmas party gig at the Cavern with guests Jerry and the Pacemakers and King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. It was -9 degrees Celsius or 16 Fahrenheit. It was the coldest day in Liverpool for 11 years. And isn't that an interesting number? Pete called in sick, so Ringo, who was still at the Hurricanes at this point, filled in for him. It was one of the first times that they would all play together as a band. Pete wasn't officially out of the Beatles yet, but the idea of replacing him with Ringo had been snuck in. It's curious that they didn't ask Fred Marsden from Jerry and the Pacemakers, or Dave Lovelady from King Size Taylor and the Dominoes to play with them. We don't actually know why Ringo was there in the first place, but it was a night off for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. It's true that the Beatles already knew Ringo from playing shared gigs together at the New Brighton Tower and also at the Kaiserkeller in Hamburg. So yes, they were friends with him, but this feels like a hidden push. In fact, official Beatles history says that John, Paul and George were thinking of asking Ringo to join the Beatles after they played together that night, but they were prevented from doing so by the knowledge that Ringo was about to leave the country. At that point, he had wanted to relocate to Texas, but the paperwork involved drove him mad, so he gave up. 3 days later, Ringo quit the Hurricanes and instead went to Hamburg to drum for Tony Sheridan at the Top 10 Club in January and February of 1962, which I discussed in my last video. Ringo was not Tony's first choice. That was Fred Marsden from Jerry and the Pacemakers, but Fred had said no. Fred then told Tony Sheridan and the Top 10 Club's manager Peter Eckhorn to ask Ringo to join them instead. In the quiet post-Christmas period, Tony and Peter actually flew to Liverpool to talk to Ringo and brought him back with them to Hamburg. Ringo had been looking for a change of scenery. That's why he'd been planning to relocate to Houston, Texas, but he found the process too complicated. For him, the offer of the Hamburg gig instead was good timing. On New Year's Eve 1961, the Beatles and Neil Aspinall made their treacherous journey down to London for their audition with Decca. The weather was atrocious, and their travel was affected by snowdrifts, blizzards, ice, dense fog, and abandoned vehicles. Even in the bigger van that Brian had hired for them, Neil still took 11 hours to drive the 200 miles, getting seriously lost at Wolverhampton. Brian, who had taken the train down to London to stay with his aunt Frida in Marylebone, met the Beatles at 10 p.m. in the foyer of the Royal Hotel on Woburn Place, where they checked in and left again to find food and fun. Brian showed them around the Charing Cross Road area, where he had worked just 4 years earlier in a book and record shop. It was at that time that the Beatles went window shopping and took down the details of the Anello and David Chelsea boots with Cuban heels that were to become an important part of their new look. They ordered 4 pairs of what were to become their Beatle boots after their return home. They spent that evening stunned at the London prices of food and drink, and disappointed that more people hadn't turned out to see the New Year in at Trafalgar Square, as per the tradition. The cold, terrible weather had put everyone off and kept them at home. Personally, I wonder why the Beatles stayed at Woburn Place. In case you don't know, it's in central London, not far from Russell Square. They drove 200 miles to London, only to still be 5 miles away from their 10 a.m. appointment in West Hampstead the next day. That meant having to drive halfway across London again in Monday morning traffic and snow. Perhaps it was the only hotel that had enough rooms available at the time, but I do find this odd. At 10 a.m. on the 1st of January 1962, the Beatles arrived for their first recording at a mainstream professional studio. They were at Decca's West Hampstead Studios in Broadhurst Gardens. They recorded in Studio 2, which was a 36-foot by 21-foot windowless basement room. It was the coldest New Year's Day in London since 1887. Outside, the temperature was -7 degrees Celsius or 19 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was not much warmer in the studio. This might account somewhat for the Beatles' uneven performance. The producer was the quite hungover Mike Smith, who, at 26 years old, was new to the job. He seems to have crept into his position quite slyly, since record producers at that time were supposed to know how to read music as part of their job, and Mike was trying to hide the fact that he couldn't. The balance engineer was 20-year-old Mike Savage. At 20 years old, he also could not have been in his job that long either. Due to Mike Smith arriving late, they had to stop for lunch and then continue afterwards. What the Beatles recorded was, essentially, most of their set for performances in December 1961. It included the 3 allegedly original songs by John and Paul. They recorded 15 songs, rather than the standard 2 to 5. Why was this the case? Was it because all the Decca staff involved were inexperienced? Or because Mike Smith kept hoping a hit single would emerge from the playlist? It's a long trek from Liverpool to London, so perhaps they were hopeful that several singles or B-sides would be chosen from that day's recordings, rather than having to ask the Beatles to return from Liverpool another day. Whatever the reason, by the end of that recording session, the Decca staff had recorded 35 minutes of Beatles music. It was basically a whole vinyl album in length. The songs they recorded were Money, That's What I Want, The Sheik of Araby, Memphis, Tennessee, 3 Cool Cats, Sure to Fall in Love with You, September in the Rain, Take Good Care of My Baby, Till There Was You, Crying, Waiting, Hoping, To Know Her Is to Love Her, Besame Mucho, Searchin', Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Loved. The Beatles, besides being very cold, also did not adapt to the goldfish bowl environment of that studio and were terrified, despite normally being cocky. John, Paul and George claimed that the Decca Demo was actually produced privately for a £15 fee by Tony Meehan, the former drummer for The Shadows, who was a recent employee at Decca. I wonder what was meant by this. Decca made copies of the 2 reel-to-reel tapes for Brian and retained the originals. Perhaps Tony Meehan made those copies. George Harrison was particularly annoyed by this because he'd had a major falling out with Tony Meehan. Tony was 5 days younger than George, yet he had immediately wanted to veto the idea of the Beatles being signed to Decca. The song selection for their audience was meant to demonstrate their range as a band. It included old tunes in various styles like rhythm and blues, country and western, rock and roll, recent rearranged chart hits, jazz and blues standards, humorous songs, and 3 originals. All the Beatles, especially Paul and John, said at the time that they weren't happy with their performance. Their nerves really got to them. Mike Smith said that he was unimpressed, and that, quote, Pete was a very average drummer and didn't keep good time. You could pick up a better drummer at any pub in London. The drummer should be the rock, and if the rock isn't good, then you should start to think, no. If Decca was to sign the Beatles, we wouldn't have used Pete Best on the records, end quote. And to this reaction, we must ask the obvious question. If Pete was so terrible as a drummer, why didn't anyone point this out to him sooner? The Decca staff played the recordings back to the Beatles on the studio floor. John said they didn't sound natural. At the end of the session, they were told that Decca would let them know, and that a decision would be at least 3 weeks away due to other commitments. Although Mike Smith was a producer in his own right, he was on a probationary period. He had to get his decisions greenlit by his boss, Dick Rowe, who was busy with the Billy Fury film Play It Cool. The backdrop to all of this was a very telling Disc magazine headline article by Don Nickel, which read, quote, Singers should not pen their own songs, spotlighting a trend that could spell disaster for pop music, end quote. Band leader Jack Payne also went on TV to say that, quote, pop music had too many souped-up sounds, and records were full of too many noises cooked up by studio engineers at the expense of musicianship, end quote. Given the work that George Martin would later contrive with and for the Beatles, this is quite hilarious, and God knows what he'd make of music now. On Thursday, the 4th of January 1962, the Beatles topped the Mersey Beat poll to find the most popular beat group in the region. Brian bought them all travelling alarm clocks as celebratory presents to encourage them to be on time for future meetings and performances. The next day, Friday the 5th of January, the My Bonnie single was released in Britain as a Beatles record. Despite all the good write-ups in music and record papers, it got no plugs from its publisher or record label, nor radio or TV play, so it went nowhere in the charts. By now, in January 1962, the contract between Brian Epstein and the Beatles was drawn up. Due to the lack of appropriate signing and witnessing, it was not actually legal, but everyone involved acted as though it was. The risk was really all Brian's to bear. He took 10%, rising to 20%, if the Beatles' gross annual earnings rose above £1,500. But if the Beatles were badly behaved, aggressive, unprofessional, not honouring agreements, turning up late or not at all, it was his reputation, the Nems business, and his family name that was at stake, as well as all the money that Brian had already spent on them. He'd bought them handmade suits, shoes, bought them PR photos, hired vans and equipment for their shows and auditions, paid for fuel and hotel rooms, all from his own pocket before he'd received a penny in commission. But Brian believed in them. He felt that he could trust them, and he would shield them from trouble if any arose. The contract he drew up with them was for 5 years. It was the longest, biggest commitment he'd ever made to anything. By this point, Brian made the Beatles pre-select and write out playlists for every performance, and make sure that they were the right length for the 45 or 60-minute gig that was expected. He took over the handling of their money, and paid them a weekly pay packet each Friday. After 3 weeks, they went from earning £15 to £25 per week. After he had promised them, aside from their lunchtime sessions, they would never work for anything less than £15 per show as a group. George Harrison remarked at the time that his dad was earning £10 per week, so £25 was a good weekly wage. Brian also drew up contractual agreements with each and every venue that they played at. He really meant business. Even their roadie, Neil Aspinall, was supplied with maps and printed route instructions for each venue. On NEMS headed paper, Brian had his secretary write to the BBC to get them an audition on BBC Radio. Back then, as a public service broadcaster, the BBC were obliged to let everyone except rank amateurs apply for auditions for free. Liverpool applications were sent to Manchester, and pop music was directed to light entertainment producer Peter Pilbeam. The Beatles' type request stood out as more professional than the usually hand-scribbled requests and quickly got them an audition on Thursday, the 8th of February 1962. They passed this audition and returned to BBC Manchester on Wednesday, the 7th of March, to play at the Playhouse Theatre, wearing brand new tailor-made suits for the very first time. BBC producer Peter Pilbeam's handwritten comments for the Beatles' audition were, quote, "an unusual group, not as rocky as most, more C&W with a tendency to play music. Yes." End quote. The Beatles' performance was broadcast on the radio on Sunday the 11th of March on Teenager's Turn as part of the Light programme network. At the beginning of February 1962, Decca finally sent a letter to Brian, formally turning them down for a record contract. Brian immediately went into action. On Tuesday, the 6th of February, he returned to London to talk to the Decca representatives again, namely Dick Rowe, Steve Beecher-Stevens, and Arthur Kelland. Brian did his best to sway them, but they wouldn't budge. Brian claimed that Dick Rowe told him, quote, "The Beatles won't go, Mr. Epstein. We know these things. You have a good record business in Liverpool. Why not stick to that?" End quote. Dick Rowe denied having said this, but according to Brian, he had also said that, quote, "Not to mince words, Mr. Epstein, we don't like your boys' sound. Groups of guitarists are on their way out." End quote. However, guitar bands at that point had never been in. The Shadows were the only guitar band in Britain at that time. Brian showed them the Merseybeat cover, with its headline of Beatles Top Poll, and told the Decca men that they were seriously missing out. Brian said the Beatles would be bigger than Elvis, which the Decca reps found ridiculous. The timing was tricky for Decca, however, as they were at the beginning of a drive for diversity in their records. Dick Rowe himself was quoted in the Decca Staff Journal as stating that he wanted Decca to have a big drive into British pop music. So why did they turn the Beatles down? Was it because they weren't up to the task, or was there another reason? At the same time that the new producer Mike Smith had auditioned the Beatles, he had given the same opportunity to Brian Paul and the Tremolos. He had wanted to give both bands a contract, but Dick Rowe vetoed this and told him that he could only sign one of them. The contract was given to the Tremolos because they were a London-based group and they had slightly more studio experience. It was the more convenient option for Decca, working with a local group rather than one that was 200 miles away. However, when Brian tried to argue the case for the Beatles, he almost certainly didn't know any of this. Dick Rowe, seeing how upset Brian was, tried to compromise with Brian. He suggested to Brian that he should speak to Tony Meehan, the new Decca A&R man and ex-Shadows drummer, about producing the Beatles privately for £100 fee. Brian was tempted and insulted in equal measure. He didn't want the Beatles recorded by people who didn't value them and who were only doing it for the money. In a letter to Tony Meehan, dated 10th of February, he formally turned them down. However, all was not lost. Out of that Decca audition, Brian had gained for the Beatles a demo recording in the form of two reel-to-reel tapes, now more commonly referred to as the Decca Demo. On Wednesday, the 7th of February 1962, he went to two more record labels in London, first Pi and then Oriole, who both gave a polite no. On Thursday, the 8th of February, Brian, now feeling very frustrated, went to the EMI-owned HMV record store in Oxford Street. In April 1961, Brian had gone to an industry function in Hamburg and Hanover as a guest of Deutsche Grammophon. Bob Boast, the manager of HMV, was also there, and the two became acquaintances. Fresh out of ideas and out of desperation, Brian went to talk to Bob Boast for advice. Bob said that it was beyond his powers to help him personally, but that budding artists could make 78 RPM demo discs on the first floor of his store. Perhaps it would help to present the Beatles' Decca Demo on acetate rather than on a reel-to-reel. This seemed like a good idea to Brian, so Bob introduced Brian to the HMV disc cutter Jim Foy. Jim said to Brian as he cut the disc that the tape sounded good. When he found out that some of the songs were written by the Beatles, he was impressed. Jim asked Brian if they were published and whether he wanted to talk to Sid Coleman, the general manager for Ardmore and Beechwood, which was on the top floor of the HMV store. Brian said he would like to talk to Sid Coleman, so after the disc was cut, they went up to see him. At 56, Sid was a sound old hand in his business, having been in the industry since 1937. Ardmore and Beechwood, the publishing arm of EMI, originally formed as an extension of Capitol Records' publishing business. Like Jim Foy, Sid Coleman also liked the Beatles' own songs and wanted to publish them. However, Brian wanted a recording contract rather than a publishing deal. He wanted the Beatles to be the first ones to record their own songs. The legend handed down as part of the official Beatles narrative is that Sid Coleman phoned George Martin to set up a meeting for Brian, but Sid's right-hand man and music plugger Kim Bennett insisted that this was not the case. Kim said that George Martin would have been the very last person that Sid Coleman would have called because he strongly disliked him. However it happened, Brian did meet George Martin on Tuesday the 13th of February 1962. According to Brian, George Martin was on the verge of dismissing the Decca Demo recording before he had even listened to it because, as George wrote himself in his own autobiography, quote, "The thought of anything coming out of the provinces was extraordinary," end quote. I think this admittance is extremely revealing of the snobbery and elitism of that time. I don't think it was just a north-south divide either. I suspect the same reaction would have been had if the Beatles had been from the West Country or East Anglia. In any case, George Martin turned the Beatles down, and Brian was very disappointed. Much later on, in a Melody Maker interview, George Martin mentioned that the song Your Feet's Too Big was on the disc that Brian played to him that day, when clearly it wasn't. George was quoted as saying, "I wasn't knocked out at all. It was a pretty lousy tape, recorded in a back room, very badly balanced, and not very good songs, and a rather raw group." End quote. All of this rather implies that he didn't actually listen to the disc at the time. He said to Brian at that meeting that he would keep a copy of the disc, listen to it some more and get back to him, although none of that was true. Ardmore and Beechwood's music plugger Kim Bennett still liked the Beatles' own songs and approached Brian again with the desire to publish them. He particularly liked Paul's song, Like Dreamers Do. He took the song back to the four EMI A&R men, who likewise turned him down. He talked to Sid Coleman again and said, quote, "We have a small budget to plug songs of our own discovery. Why don't you go to Len Wood and say that if EMI gives us the record, we will pay for the cost, Because it's a group, it'll be straightforward studio production, no orchestra. We'll have 2 copyrights for the next 50 years, plus maybe a royalty on the record." End quote. EMI's managing director Len Wood had other ideas, however. George Martin had turned Brian and the Beatles down, but Len Wood overruled him. This might well be partly due to the fact that George Martin's affair with his secretary, Judy Lockhart Smith, had become known to him, and it made the company look bad. Len Wood referred to it as a, quote, red-hot scandal. George had left his wife Sheena in the spring of 1962, but she would not grant him a divorce. It was a difficult situation for George. Len Wood wasn't pleased, and offloading the Beatles onto him seemed like a subtle punishment to keep him busy and away from his secretary Judy. George Martin re-signed his contract at that time, whilst trying to bluff his way into getting a pay raise that didn't happen. He needed his job more than ever because he still had to pay for his wife and children, plus the cost of his new home near Judy. Producer Ron Richards and balance engineer Norman Smith were convinced that this was the reason why George Martin, rather than any other producer, got the job of working with the Beatles, although for me, being a Freemason must surely have helped. Norman Smith said that L.G. Wood did not approve of people having affairs, and he certainly didn't approve of George going off with his secretary, not at all. I think it offended his moral standards. L.G. virtually ordered George to record the Beatles. End quote. After Len Wood assigned the Beatles to George Martin, Sid Coleman was informed that his wish to publish the first 3 Beatles-owned songs would be granted. Kim Bennett described what happened like this, quote, "Time went by since I'd floated my Beatles idea. Weeks. Then one day, Sid came to my office door with a grin on his face, rubbing his hands. He said, 'I've just been talking to Len Wood on the phone. We're going to get our record made after all.'" End quote. After a short pause and stunned silence, Kim then asked, "Oh, who's going to do it then?" "George Martin," came Sid's reply. So it was a sop to Sid and a punishment to George? This might all well be true, but this explanation avoids the bigger underlying reason stated in the memoirs of Billy Shears. According to that book, the Beatles were pulled into EMI prematurely to avoid Brian's interfering with their plans for the great Beatles psyop. Once the Beatles were asked to perform at the EMI studios, it became quickly obvious that it would take them far too long to learn to play the pieces required for their singles and albums. So studio musicians were used instead, as per the Wrecking Crew model, and the Beatles merely sang on their early recordings. Of the meeting between Brian Epstein and George Martin on the 13th of February, the footnote on page 107 of Memoirs says this, quote, "By that meeting, and by EMI receiving reports from others describing what Brian was doing, it became time for EMI to act before he interfered with EMI's plans. Although the project was not yet to that point, EMI assigned the Beatles to George Martin. George eventually agreed to use their voices." End quote. And I'm also going to read another footnote from Memoirs from page 75. After their Tony Sheridan single, the Beatles' first 2 A-side songs on singles were Love Me Do and Please Please Me. From the Decca recordings on the 1st of January 1962, Brian Epstein created a demo which Sid Coleman arranged for Brian to share with George Martin on the 13th of February. Upon hearing the samples, George called them rubbish. However, after declining the offer, he was overruled by a superior. Shocked to be ordered to take them on, George had the band come to EMI Studios on the 6th of June. After working with them for 3 hours in Studio 2, he determined that further recording would have to wait until suitable songs were written for them. The first song offered to them, which George planned to be their first hit, was How Do You Do It? To teach the song to the lads before their next recording session, George made a demo and had it delivered to them. It was recorded by Barry Mason, backed by the Dave Clark 5. Later, Bill also made such demos for them. On the 4th of September, the band returned to EMI. They rehearsed for 3 hours in the afternoon with Ron Richards in Studio 3. Ron taught them 5 new songs, including Love Me Do and Please Please Me. Afterward, George took them to dinner and then returned them to Ron for their recording session, scheduled from 7 to 10 p.m. Struggling, it lasted until 11:15. Before going home that night, George Martin and Norman Smith mixed and cut acetates of How Do You Do It and Love Me Do. In the morning, George and Brian listened together to the acetates. The vocals were weak, the guitars lacked precision, the inventive drumming was distracting, and How Do You Do It could not measure up to the demo. George was ordered to work with the band directly, to proceed as if Ron's recordings never existed, and to record their first hit single on the 11th of September. Besides that date already having historical military significance, it was also Teddy Adorno's birthday, and was exactly 1 month before the opening of the Second Vatican Council, giving the Beatles a 1-month head start. The purpose of this video was to look at the Beatles' history, from meeting Brian Epstein to making their demo with Decca and then getting signed by EMI. Before I close, however, I'd like to offer some thoughts about the role that Brian played in the Beatles' evolution to stardom. In one sense, the Beatles were always earmarked for success, with or without Brian as their manager. The real debate is whether or not Brian knew that he was part of the Beatles' psyop from the very start. I know some may vehemently disagree with me, and that's their right, but I think that Brian probably didn't know much about the Beatles' psyop until they were signed, and even then, just like the Beatles themselves, I think Brian didn't really understand the true nature of that plan until Paul died, and by then, all of them were in too deep, and there was no way out except through their own deaths. Subsequently, Brian and the 3 remaining Beatles finally understood the kinds of people that they were working for, the kind that demand loyalty at pain of death. Conspiracies operate as a hierarchy. Only a few people at the top actually know the whole plan. Every level underneath works on a need-to-know basis, resulting in the people on the bottom level actually knowing very little, if anything, about the true nature of the agenda that they are serving. I don't doubt for a second that the Beatles had help in their pre-EMI days via an invisible hand. Maybe that invisible hand included the Beatles being helped by Brian Epstein, but I still don't believe that Brian knew about the psyop before he and the Beatles were signed to EMI. According to memoirs, Billy tells us that both royal and Rothschild money was being used to fund the Beatles psyop. If Brian understood this at the beginning, then he would have to be incredibly stupid to interfere with their psyop and try to beat them at their own game by getting the Beatles signed to another record company. Yes, Brian and the Beatles lied about their level of talent, but I suspect that they were told that no one writes or plays on their own records, and that this kind of deception was standard music industry practice. Sadly, that's not a lie. So Brian and the Beatles could have happily consoled themselves with the idea that everyone else is doing it, so why can't we? If we look at Brian from the point of view of the controllers of this psyop, Brian transformed the Beatles into a band that had greater appeal to a wider demographic, and he did so initially with his own money. Not only did this suit the controllers' agenda, it meant that they did not even have to use their own funds to bring it about. They must have rubbed their hands together with glee. The legacy of Brian's interfering is with us to this day in the form of the Decca Demo. The Decca Demo is a thorn in the side of EMI and Apple. Much time and money was spent in lawsuits against small labels who tried to release that music. Its existence, rather like the Star Club recordings, provides examples of the early Beatles performances that don't measure up to the mythology of even the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me. I'm sure that the controllers of the Beatles psyop would rather that those early recordings had never existed. I think when Brian spoke about how much he valued the relationships he had with the Beatles, he really meant it. And in that sense, Brian was no different from anyone else. He needed to feel kinship, and to know that he could be of help and service to the Beatles, because doing so made him feel a sense of validation as a person. However, I think it would be naive to think that Brian was completely innocent. Via his involvement with the Krays, he partook in services that he really should have left well alone, such as illegal drugs and casinos, and the use of rent boys who were most probably underage. He also made some awful business deals later on that lost the Beatles a lot of money and allowed himself to be blackmailed for funds that were taken from the Beatles' accounts. George Martin alluded to the elitist idea that outstanding musical talent was unlikely to originate from the provinces. That's because he operated in an environment run by the middle class and privately educated, signified by a regionless accent. An accent is like an audible flag. When strangers hear it, they make all sorts of assumptions about someone's family background, their education, talents, intelligence, and status. Brian Epstein was not the man with the Midas touch that he was made out to be, but he was a rather-voiced, middle-class go-between for northern musical acts that otherwise never stood a chance in, say, the West End of London. As a businessman that they could relate to, Brian instilled some sense of order into the Beatles' behaviour and appearance. The Beatles were a pretty haphazard bunch, even before Paul died. Brian managed their daily activities at ground level and held them together. That's why when Brian died in 1967, John Lennon immediately knew that the band's days were numbered. And that's the end of my video. If you've made it this far, then thank you very, very much. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.